They saw the abandoned town, then the mist. What happened next is everyone's worst nightmare. Today's tale is about a group of friends who venture to an abandoned village tucked away in the mountains of Spain. The place is steeped in eerie folklore, with stories of hauntings and strange occurrences. When they finally arrive, the atmosphere of the deserted town is even more unsettling than they expected. On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez crouched down next to a moss-covered log. With practiced precision, he pulled out his pocket knife and sliced the stem of a mushroom growing there. Adding this latest find to the woven basket he carried, Enrique straightened up, taking a moment to admire the breathtaking view of the vibrant green valley stretching out below him. Enrique wasn't alone on this outing. He had come to the mountains with his wife, Ana, and their two close friends, Jorge and Sofia, who were a couple. They had chosen this remote spot not only to hunt for wild mushrooms, but also to satisfy Jorge's curiosity about the infamous abandoned village nearby, an eerie place surrounded by legends of supernatural activity. The trip to this remote mountain area had been Jorge's suggestion. He'd come across stories about a place called La Musara, a supposedly haunted, long-abandoned village surrounded by eerie legends and chilling folklore. Jorge was intrigued and wanted to see it for himself. Enrique, on the other hand, wasn't particularly interested in ghost stories or haunted villages. For him, the trip was all about the chance to forage for wild mushrooms, a hobby he genuinely loved. Enrique and his wife Ana lived in a bustling port city called Tarragona, where life was anything but quiet. Enrique worked long nights as a bartender, constantly surrounded by crowds of people. For him, escaping the noise and chaos of the city to spend a peaceful day in the mountains was too good an opportunity to pass up. As they ascended the mountain trails, Enrique paused to take in the stunning view of the lush green valley below. The tranquility of the landscape only deepened his enthusiasm for the day ahead. He was particularly eager to find a prized variety of mushroom known as the bloody milk cap. With that thought in mind, the group pressed on, making their way further uphill. As the mist thickened around them, the eerie outlines of crumbling buildings began to emerge, the outskirts of La Musara. La Musara was a village with a history stretching back over 900 years. Today, it was little more than a collection of crumbling ruins, some of which were believed to date back to prehistoric times. The village had never been very large. At its peak, it housed around 300 residents. But about 40 years ago, the last remaining inhabitants had abandoned the area, leaving La Musara as nothing more than a ghost town. The group of friends slowly approached a structure on the outskirts of the village. It was nothing more than a ruin, with only 3 walls still standing and no roof to speak of. They stopped to take in their surroundings. From this vantage point, they could see the remnants of what had once been the main street of the village, a narrow dirt road that ran straight through the heart of La Musara. On either side were the skeletal remains of houses, their foundations and rubble scattered like forgotten relics of the past. Further down the road, about 200 feet away, stood a church with an imposing steeple. Unlike the other buildings, the church seemed relatively intact, though time had clearly left its mark. Behind the church, partially obscured by the growing mist, they could make out an overgrown cemetery where wild plants and shrubs had taken over the gravestones. To the side of the church lay a pond, similarly overrun with vegetation, its surface alive with the croaking of frogs that echoed through the deserted landscape. The friends stood silently by the ruins, gazing out at the village. They had expected the place to feel eerie, given the stories they had heard, but standing there in person, the oppressive atmosphere was far more unnerving than they had anticipated. The air felt heavy, almost as if the village itself was watching them. As they stared down the main street, they noticed mist beginning to roll in. At first, it seemed harmless, but it quickly thickened, cloaking the village in a veil of fog. Jorge recalled what he had read during his research about La Musara. He had mentioned to the others that the mist was a defining feature of the village. By evening, it would completely envelop the area in a thick, white haze. But what caught them off guard was the fact that it was still the middle of the day, and already the fog was creeping in. Jorge broke the silence with a grin. "Hey, I want to show you something," he said, grabbing Sofia's hand and jogging a little down the main road toward the church. Enrique and Ana exchanged glances before following behind. After walking just a short distance, maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique glanced back at the spot they'd just left near the crumbling structure. To his surprise, it was already out of sight, swallowed by the creeping fog that had silently rolled in. The realization sent a small shiver down his spine. Fog like this was supposed to come at night, not in broad daylight. Still, he brushed the unease aside, telling himself it was just a weather quirk. Turning his attention forward, he hurried to catch up with Jorge and Sofia. When Enrique and Ana reached them, Jorge was standing next to a peculiar rectangular stone, jutting about 2 feet out of the ground. Its surface was rough and marked with strange, time-worn engravings. Placing his hand confidently on top of the stone, Jorge grinned as he said, "This is it, the famous Sis stone. They say it holds dark powers." Intrigued, Enrique and Ana leaned in as Jorge launched into an explanation. "This stone is one of the oldest things here," he began. "Back in ancient times, armies marched through this area. It's even where La Musara got its name, the place to march. Those armies would always stop here, right at this stone. They believed it had magical properties that could bring them victory in battle." "Magical properties?" Ana asked, raising an eyebrow. Jorge nodded. "The legend says that it holds immense power that comes with risks. Some believe touching it can give you visions or a surge of energy. Others say it might pull you into a parallel world, one filled with shadows and less than friendly entities." He smirked, clearly enjoying the theatrics of the story, but the way his fingers lingered on the stone suggested he was more intrigued than he let on. Sofia took a step back, her expression serious. "You shouldn't be touching it, Jorge. Don't tempt fate." "Relax, it's just a rock," Jorge said with a chuckle, removing his hand. He gestured to the group. "Come on, who's next?" Sofia immediately shook her head. "Not a chance. I'm not messing with this thing." Ana, however, stepped forward with a small smile. "Fine, I'll do it." She took a deep breath and reached out, pressing her palm against the cool surface of the stone. The group watched in tense silence, almost expecting something dramatic to happen. After a few moments of nothing but stillness, Ana pulled her hand away and laughed. "See? No demons here." The group joined in her laughter, but Enrique suddenly froze. From somewhere near the church, the sound of croaking frogs became inexplicably louder, so loud it felt unnatural. His attention snapped toward the overgrown pond, which was partially visible through the mist. Straining his eyes, he tried to figure out what was causing the noise. As he stared, the fog seemed to part slightly, giving him a fleeting view of one of the church's broken windows. Inside, a shadowy figure stood motionless, facing him. The sight sent a chill down Enrique's spine. He blinked, and in that instant, the fog closed in again, hiding the figure and the window from view. Enrique stood frozen, questioning whether he'd truly seen anything at all. Before he could process it, Ana called out to him, laughing. "Come on, Enrique! Your turn to touch the stone." He turned to see the others still smiling and joking, blissfully unaware of what he'd just witnessed. Hesitating for a moment, Enrique glanced back at the church, its eerie silhouette blurred by the fog. Telling himself it had to be his imagination, he approached the stone. Reluctantly, he placed his hand on the surface. The moment he made contact, the air around him seemed to shift. A strange coolness enveloped him, while the stone beneath his hand grew warm. An odd sense of calm and focus washed over him, as though the stone was drawing him in. For a fleeting moment, Enrique felt like he could stay there forever. But deep in the recesses of his mind, a warning voice whispered, "Let go. Get away. Now." Snapping out of the trance, Enrique yanked his hand away, gasping as if he'd been holding his breath. The strange sensations vanished immediately, leaving him shaken and disoriented. Jorge and Ana were grinning at him, clearly eager to hear about his experience. Sofia, however, remained wary, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We've done enough tempting of fate for one day," she said sharply. "Let's leave." Jorge wrapped an arm around her, attempting to ease her nerves. "Come on, Sofia. It's just a harmless old stone." But Enrique couldn't shake the feeling that the stone was far from harmless. Something about it felt deeply wrong, as if it had reached out and touched more than just his hand. "Come on, let's explore some more," Jorge said enthusiastically, taking Sofia's hand and leading her further down the main road toward the church. Ana quickly followed behind them, almost jogging to keep up, her excitement making her feel like a kid on an adventure. Enrique, however, lingered for a moment. He told himself that what he thought he saw earlier, something dark in the church window, had to be his imagination. Still, there was a lingering unease he couldn't shake. Ever since he touched that strange stone, something felt off. Not just with the stone, but with the entire village. The fog, now blanketing the area in a dense shroud, only added to his discomfort. Enrique took a deep breath, deciding not to ruin the mood. He didn't want to be the one to break the group's adventurous spirit. With that thought, he turned and followed the others down the misty path. As he walked, the fog parted slightly, revealing the overgrown pond near the church. The croaking of the frogs was deafening now, a sound so loud it seemed unnatural. He glanced toward the church window, the one where he thought he'd seen a figure earlier. It was empty. Relief washed over him. As Enrique moved closer, he noticed his friends hadn't stopped at the church or tried to go inside. Instead, they had made their way around the back, toward the cemetery. He felt a flicker of gratitude. They weren't lingering near the building that unnerved him. Even so, as he passed the pond and approached the church, he hesitated. The sight of that window drew him in, almost like an invisible force was pulling him toward it. Against his better judgment, Enrique found himself standing directly in front of the window. He peered inside. The interior of the church was dark and desolate, its floor littered with debris from the collapsed ceiling. The wooden pews, now rotted and broken, lay scattered across the ground. The pulpit, where sermons were once delivered, was barely recognizable beneath the dust and decay. Something about the scene held him there. He leaned closer to the window, almost without realizing it. It was as though the church itself was calling to him, inviting him to come closer. The world around him seemed to fade. The only sound was the relentless, maddening croak of the frogs. It grew louder and louder, filling his ears, drowning out everything else. Meanwhile, in the cemetery behind the church, Ana, Jorge, and Sofia were wandering among the gravestones, exchanging jokes and observations about the weathered inscriptions. At one point, Ana happened to glance toward the church and realized Enrique wasn't with them. "Where did he go?" she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She walked over to the cemetery gate and looked up along the side of the church. That's when she saw him. Enrique was leaning toward the window, motionless, staring inside. "Enrique!" she called out. He didn't respond. She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. He stood as if transfixed, unaware of her voice. Concerned, Ana hurried up to him. When she reached his side, she shook his shoulder gently. The touch jolted Enrique out of his trance. He turned to look at her, his expression distant and confused, like someone waking from a strange dream. Ana frowned at him. "Come on, Enrique. We're all in the cemetery. What are you doing out here?" Without waiting for a response, she turned and headed back toward the others, skipping a little, as if to shake off the tension of the moment. Once Anna was back in the cemetery, she resumed exploring, curiously inspecting the weathered gravestones scattered across the area. As she studied one particularly old headstone, she stepped back to get a better view. Her heel accidentally knocked against another nearby marker, a large cross etched with a distinctive line across it. Before she could react, the cross toppled over and hit the ground with a loud crack, breaking in half. The noise startled Jorge and Sofia, who quickly turned to see what had happened. They immediately understood the situation. Jorge burst out laughing, shaking his head. "Oh, great job, Anna! Now you've gone and angered the spirits of this place. You'd better fix that before they come after you." Anna tried to laugh along, but her nervous smile betrayed her growing panic. She hated the thought of having damaged a grave, especially in a place like this with its eerie reputation. Quickly, she knelt down and started picking up the broken pieces, trying to place them back as they were. But it was no use. The headstone was too damaged to restore. As Anna continued fumbling with the pieces, Jorge's laughter only grew louder. "Better hurry," he teased, "before the ghosts decide to teach you a lesson." Sofia, standing beside Jorge, wasn't amused. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting around the foggy cemetery. "Jorge, stop it," she said, her voice tense. "Is it true? Is this place really haunted? I mean, all the stories. Are they real?" At that, Jorge's laughter faded. He turned to Sofia, his expression more serious now. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I think it is. There's a reason people stay away from La Musara. Let me tell you what I've read about why this village is known to be cursed." In October 1873, during a civil war in this region of Spain, one of the warring factions used caves near La Musara as makeshift field hospitals for their wounded soldiers. One night, a renowned general named Serros was gravely injured in battle and brought to one of these caves, where he ultimately succumbed to his injuries. General Serros was deeply respected, and his death was a devastating loss. However, the soldiers knew they had to keep his passing a secret. If word spread, it would crush their army's morale and embolden their enemies. A small group of 6 soldiers decided to bury him in secret. They constructed a coffin, placed his body inside, and, under the cover of darkness, carried it to the cemetery behind the church in La Musara. There, they buried him in an unmarked grave. Weeks later, a group of 5 rival soldiers climbed the mountain to La Musara, searching for General Serros. Unaware of his death, they believed he was hiding somewhere in the village. The soldiers stormed through the village, breaking into homes and interrogating the terrified residents. They threatened the villagers with death if they didn't reveal the general's location. After about an hour of chaos, an elderly man stepped forward, unable to bear it any longer. He confessed that General Serros was dead and buried in the cemetery behind the church. The rival soldiers were skeptical and demanded proof. The old man admitted he didn't know the exact grave, but had heard that was where the general was buried. The soldiers rounded up the entire village and marched them to the cemetery. Once there, the soldiers ordered the villagers to dig up every grave in search of the general. Reluctantly, the villagers began to exhume the graves. As they worked, the croaking of frogs in a nearby pond grew louder and louder, to the point where it was almost deafening. Frustrated by the noise, the leader of the soldiers stormed over to the pond and fired his gun into the water, hoping to silence the frogs. But the noise only grew more intense, as if defying his efforts. The leader eventually gave up and returned to the cemetery, where the villagers had dug up nearly every grave without finding the general. The soldiers were growing impatient. Then the leader noticed one grave that hadn't been touched. It stood alone, undisturbed, with a faint line etched into its weathered headstone. He ordered the villagers to dig it up. The villagers froze, visibly uneasy. One finally spoke up, explaining that this was the grave of a woman believed to be a witch, and disturbing it would bring terrible misfortune. The soldiers didn't care. They raised their weapons and forced the villagers to comply. The coffin was unearthed and opened. Everyone fell silent. The woman's body inside was perfectly preserved, though she had been dead for weeks. Her skin was pale but showed no signs of decay. Her cheeks retained a faint blush, and her lips were parted as if she had been frozen mid-sentence. Most unsettling of all were her eyes, wide open, staring straight ahead, almost as if she were alive. The villagers screamed and backed away in terror. Even the soldiers were unnerved, though their reaction was one of anger rather than fear. Frustrated that they hadn't found the general, they dragged the woman's body out of the coffin, tied her to a tree, and riddled her with bullets until there was nothing left. As they stopped firing, they realized the frogs had gone completely silent, and an unnatural stillness hung over the village. Spooked by the eerie atmosphere, the soldiers fled without a word. After the soldiers left, the villagers began reburying the graves. As they prepared to refill the witch's grave, someone jumped into the pit and discovered another coffin buried beneath hers. It contained the body of General Seros, hidden beneath the witch's grave by the 6 soldiers who had buried him there in secret. To avoid suspicion, they had placed just enough soil over his coffin to conceal it, intending for the grave to appear as though it only held the witch's body. From that day forward, La Musara was never the same. Crops failed, plagues swept through the village, and strange events became commonplace. By the 1950s, the last remaining residents abandoned the cursed town, leaving it a ghost village shrouded in legend. As Jorge finished recounting the tale, Anna felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at the broken headstone she had accidentally toppled earlier and noticed the faint line etched into its surface. Her breath caught. It was the same headstone that had marked the witch's grave in Jorge's story. Suddenly overwhelmed, Anna was about to call out to Jorge and Sofia to leave when something caught her eye near the base of the cemetery wall. A perfect, bloody milk-cap mushroom. It was the exact variety Enrique had been searching for. She picked it up, intending to show it to him, but when she turned around, Enrique was nowhere to be seen. A sense of dread crept over her. Had he ever followed her into the cemetery? She couldn't remember. Anna called out for Enrique, her voice cutting through the dense fog, but there was no response. Worried, she turned to Sofia and Jorge, whose outlines were barely visible through the mist. "Have you seen Enrique? Is he here? Did you notice where he went?" she asked, her voice tinged with rising panic. Both of them shook their heads, confused. "No, we haven't seen him," Jorge replied. Anna's anxiety deepened. The unsettling atmosphere of La Musara, with its suffocating fog and eerie silence, was beginning to overwhelm her. She let the mushroom she'd been holding slip from her hand and ran out of the cemetery in search of her husband. Sofia and Jorge, not fully understanding the urgency of the situation, followed at a more casual pace. The fog grew thicker as they left the cemetery, and visibility became almost non-existent. Anna's voice echoed faintly as she continued calling for Enrique. Sofia and Jorge picked up their pace, walking along the church's perimeter, but the mist made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every so often, shadows appeared in the fog, moving just out of reach. Each time, they thought it might be Anna or Enrique, but as they approached, there was nothing there. Sofia clung tighter to Jorge's arm. "This isn't funny anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. Even Jorge, who had joked earlier about the haunted reputation of the village, was beginning to feel unsettled. The pair quickened their steps, moving toward Anna's faint voice. As they drew closer, the croaking of the frogs near the pond grew louder. The sound swelled, becoming so deafening that it drowned out Anna's voice entirely. Then, without warning, the frogs went silent. In the eerie stillness that followed, Sophia and Jorge finally heard Anna. She wasn't calling out anymore. She was crying. Following the sound, they found her crouched on the ground, her back to them, at the exact spot where Enrique had been standing earlier, staring into the church window. Sophia and Jorge approached cautiously. "Ana," Jorge said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. When Ana turned to face them, tears streamed down her face. She clutched Enrique's wicker basket, still filled with the mushrooms he'd gathered. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's gone," she said. For the next hour, the three searched for Enrique in vain. The fog made it nearly impossible to see, and the approaching darkness only made things worse. By the end of their search, they were forced to accept that they couldn't find him on their own. They left La Musara to alert the authorities. In the following week, a large-scale search effort was launched around the village and its surrounding areas. Search teams combed through the foggy ruins, but no trace of Enrique was ever found. His disappearance remained a mystery. Eventually, the search was called off, with officials suggesting he had likely wandered off and succumbed to the elements, though Anna refused to believe this explanation. Determined to find answers, Anna returned to La Musara several times in the months that followed. In January 1992, 3 months after Enrique's disappearance, she convinced Sophia and Jorge to join her for another search. As they walked through the ruins, they passed by the church and stopped near the window where Enrique had last been seen. Peering inside, they froze. On the church floor, where the pews and pulpit once stood, 6 dark figures cloaked in heavy robes stood in a circle. They weren't moving or speaking, just standing there, their presence deeply unnerving. Anna, initially annoyed, assumed they were ghost hunters. Since Enrique's disappearance had made the news, La Musara had attracted thrill-seekers and paranormal enthusiasts. "Unbelievable," Anna muttered, stepping toward the window. "Have some respect. This isn't a game." She prepared to shout at the robed figures to leave, but as she reached the window, one of the figures turned toward her. Anna's breath caught. The figure had no face, just an empty, black void where a face should have been. Yet she could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, locked onto her. She stumbled backward in shock, too stunned to speak. Before any of them could react further, an explosive sound broke through the silence. The thunder of galloping hooves, as though a cavalry were charging toward them. At the same time, the frogs in the nearby pond resumed their croaking, louder and more chaotic than ever. Anna, Sophia, and Jorge spun around, expecting to see horses or some other source of the noise. But there was nothing, just the swirling fog. Turning back to the window, they saw that the 6 figures had vanished. A deep, primal fear overtook them, and without another word, the 3 sprinted out of La Musara, leaving the eerie village behind. Enrique was never found. His disappearance, along with the mysterious events of that day, remains unsolved. Over the years, others who have ventured into La Musara have also vanished without a trace, adding to the village's dark and haunting reputation. Thank you for listening to this thrilling story about La Musara. If you found this story as exciting as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like the video.